In this module, we'll be looking at the social constructionist approach to the study of human sexuality. The social constructionist approach suggests that social forces are just as important as biology in determining sex and sexuality. From this perspective, we have to consider that human actions are subject to social forces and social environments, and therefore, human actions and decisions are subject to change. Sex and sexuality is something that we learn within a social context and therefore can be very different for people across different times and spaces. Social construction theories have a long and solid history within the field of sociology, but the application to work on gender and sexuality really didn't begin until the late 1960s. The idea was to take a social constructionist approach as a response to earlier notions of biological essentialism that were so foundational to the early sexologists. As a reminder, the essentialist view is that human behavior is natural, and therefore, in this respect, sexuality is predetermined by biological sex or gender. Sexuality, therefore, is genetic, biological, and physiological, and it's not subject to change. Human behavior, especially sexual behavior, is therefore an expression of an underlying biological drive. Now, in contrast, the constructionist point of view suggested that society and social forces also play a role in how we understand and express our sexuality. This isn't to say that there's no space for biology, but that we can't ignore the roles of social forces in shaping how we understand and think about sex and sexuality in our society. So, what do social constructionists mean when they say sexuality is learned? Surely they cannot be suggesting that one can change their sexual orientation. I want to be clear that this is not the argument of social constructionists. Rather, they suggest that instead of focusing only on biological drive, we have to consider the power of social forces when thinking about sex and sexuality. In the course of growing up, we're all taught different messages by society through interactions with other people or social institutions. In terms of sex and sexuality, we can be taught what feelings or desires are counted as sexual, and context can mean a lot. Take, for example, a baby sucking her finger. This is a very different situation than if you saw an adult woman sucking her finger, which could be viewed in some contexts as sexual. We're also taught what are appropriate sexual behaviors, identities, and interactions by society. For example, most people in the United States are taught that having sex in public is not acceptable. In addition, some sociologists, like John Gagnon and William Simons, have suggested there are various rules we're taught about sexual interaction and discourse. They call these sexual scripts, and we'll be talking about them in more detail later this week. In addition to teaching us where we should have sex and when, society also teaches us with whom we should be having sex, in terms of age, race, and even class. Take, for example, the scenario of seeing a much older man with a much younger woman in a romantic situation. Now flip that. What if you saw a much older woman with a much younger man? How has society taught us to respond to seeing these types of scenarios? Society also teaches us what all of this means in terms of norms, values, and how we should behave within the context of our communities. Therefore, from a social constructionist point of view, one cannot separate sex from society. There's a variability of sexual forms, beliefs, ideologies, and behaviors, especially when we consider culture and time. We also need to keep in mind that society produces sexuality in complex ways. There can be multiple, even contradictory teachers. For example, religion, family, law, and media might all teach us different lessons about human sexuality. And therefore, it is the practice of sexuality that gives meaning to human activities rather than a natural or biological drive.